Thank you all for coming today. This should hopefully be a light on the technical, heavy on the fun side kind of talk. This was actually first requested by John Baldwin, who came to me and said, well, can you talk about the history of the daemon? And I said, well, I've never really given a talk like that before. And the problem is that I have lots of stuff I want to show. And so I said, well, it's going to be in San Jose, so you can just drive on down. So I brought a giant suitcase, mostly that's full of things like T-shirts, which I'll go through and talk about as we get to the relevant parts of the talk. Let's start with the name of the daemon. The daemon never had a name. He's just the BSD daemon. But people just couldn't cope with the fact that the daemon didn't have a name. And so they just kept coming up with names. And someone decided the name was Chuck. And I mean, there's a lot of names they could have come up with, but Chuck was the person that drove me crazy in high school. And there was no way the daemon was going to be named Chuck. Although you'll see there's one shirt up here that's labeled Chuck the Daemon. That design got kiboshed, and I have the only copy of that shirt. Finally, when I just said, all right, we need to have a name, we decided that it would be Beastie. I dug through my notes to try and find or email to see who came up with that name, and I couldn't find it. But the point that I also often like to make is that he's not a demon. People keep referring to him as a demon. A demon is an evil spirit. Rather, he's a daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N, which is defined as a deified being, half man, half God. When you're dealing with software, you need at least half God on your side. So let's start at the very beginning. Where did the first daemon come up? This is the earliest that I know, was a first attempt at doing a drawing. This was actually commissioned by someone named Mike O'Brien. Phil Folio had lived in an apartment that he shared with somebody else. And this particular apartment had a built-in safe in the wall. And they kept their valuables, passports, and other things in there. And then Phil's roommate had left. And Phil's roommate was the only person that knew the combination. And Phil had a bunch of his stuff in the safe and no way of figuring out how to open it. So Mike O'Brien actually had training and a license actually to be a locksmith. Now, he admitted to me that he knew nothing about safes, but he had a book that said how to do it. And apparently it was a pretty cheap-based safe. So in about 15 minutes, he was able to get the safe open. And so the remuneration that he got from Phil was that Phil would draw this picture. If you look carefully, you'll see that because of the way it got printed, the PDP-11 is backwards from what it ought to be. Other than that minor detail, it has the PDP-11, which of course was what ran UNIX at the time. And, we've got dev null over here, and we've got pipes and so on and so forth. And so then he came up with these little characters that are running around, and those are the background daemons that are, running things to get work done for you. This image was passed off to a family shirt printing shop that was in Chicago, and they made up a bunch of these shirts. There were 4 of them that were made with special red frill on the sleeves and around the base. And those shirts went to Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie, and Mike O'Brien kept 2 of them. And in fact, this is one of them that I borrowed from Mike O'Brien long enough to take this picture and then had to send back to him. The actual artwork stayed at the family shop, and then they closed, and Armando Stetner at DEC got it because he wanted to use it for publicity for the DEC PDP-11 stuff that ran UNIX. When I contacted Armando Stetner to see what had happened to it, he had no idea. So as far as we know, that artwork is now lost. Next sort of step of that was that UNIX wanted to use the same image, and so in June of 1985, on their 10th anniversary, they printed up this shirt, and you'll see that it's essentially the exact same image, with the exception that Folio's signature is somehow missing off of this picture. This will be a theme that you're going to hear. When things get used, they love to drop the artist's signature off of them, so more to come on that topic. So now we get to the very first John Lasseter drawn daemon. It was drawn in black and white and was used on the BSD manual covers. How in the world did John Lasseter ever get pulled into doing this? John Lasseter started out as an animation person for Walt Disney. And there are 3 levels of people that work there. So there's the top level people, and they draw things a frame apart. And then the people that are directly below them on the food chain are called the in-betweeners. And so they fill in the other 29 frames from this one to that one. And then the lowest people on the totem pole are the colorizers. And they're the ones that fill in the colors of these cells. And the only sort of artistic thing is that they get to draw like the tail, and so they get the tail to go or something like that, so that's their call and lot. All of Disney's stuff was done by hand. It was every single frame was drawn, colorized, and filmed. It's just how they started, and that's how they continued doing it. So John Lasseter was one of the top level guys, the one that did a cell apart. Those people were treated kind of like university professors. As a university professor, every 5 or 6 years, you get a sabbatical, and it's where you get 6 months where you're still paid, but you just get to go off and do whatever suits you. So John Lasseter got a 6-month sabbatical, and he decided that he would go spend it at Lucasfilm. This was right after the very first Star Wars had come out, and that was all done with models and blue screen and so on in the traditional way. But the goal was to try and get more computerization in there. And a lot of that was just digitizing the models and, being able to do things with them more readily. But one of the sort of external projects that they were working on at Lucasfilm at that point was what they wanted to call an animator's workstation. And there they had these people that knew all about computer graphics and how to make computer graphics sing, but they hadn't a clue what someone that actually wanted to do animation would want as a user interface. And so by having John Lasseter come there, they had 6 months of somebody basically tell them, this is crap, you need to do this, you need to do that, this should work this way, etc. And so by the end of 6 months, they had developed something which John Lasseter was really excited about. And so his sabbatical ended, and he went back to Disney and said, we need to move forward, we need to get a bunch of these animators workstations, and this is the new way going forward, computers in animation. Well, this was not well received by Disney. They explained to him that we differentiate ourselves from all these other people who are also doing it all by hand because we just have the highest quality, which was true. Why should we give up our franchise to, something that might or might not work? And besides, anybody can buy computers. So John Lasseter was rather demoralized by this. And so he ended up leaving Disney and going back to Lucasfilm to become an employee there. Timeline-wise, we were just in the midst of finishing up 4.2 BSD, and Sam Leffler was one of the people that was working on that project, and he was done with working on BSD. He wanted to move on to something else, and so he ended up going to Lucasfilm to start working on some of the things that they were doing there. So he was actually at Lucasfilm when John Lasseter came back and began working there full time. One of the things for 4.2 was we were going to put out manuals, and we needed a picture to go on the front of the manual. He showed the previous pictures that I've been showing you here of the Daemon, saying, we need something like this. And so John Lasseter then drew this image. So this was the first of this style of Daemon. If you look at the feet on these Daemons here, they look, again, a lot more like the feet you see here. You're not wearing any shoes or anything. This is, again, on the front of the 4.2 manuals. These were actually printed by the UNIX organization because at that time you had to be licensed, have a license from AT&T to have UNIX, and UNIX had such a license, and so they could make sure that the manuals were only sold to people that had appropriate licensing. Oh, and you'll notice that the Daemon, in the glowing orb there, it says UNIX TM. This was something that became a bone of contention later. So you'll see in some of the later Daemons, it's just a glowing orb with nothing on it. What did Lasseter do after that? Lucasfilm, after the first 3 Star Wars came out, then he didn't have the money coming in, so he couldn't spend nearly as lavishly as he had been. So he spun off the computer people into this little sub-company that he called Pixar. John Lasseter went to Pixar. And up to that point, they hadn't done any kind of animation that was more than a couple minutes. Andrew and Wally B was an example that they would show at conferences and things like that. John had always wanted to do a feature-length film. They just didn't have the resources to do that. Steve Jobs got involved, and Steve Jobs then got a contract with Walt Disney, and Walt Disney controlled everything. So they said, all right, we get your first 5 films, and doing a reprise of one doesn't count as another film. They've got to be 5 distinct films. We're going to completely pay for it, but we get 90% of all the proceeds that come in from the movies. After they'd had the first 2 successful ones, those terms got calmed down a little bit. John Lasseter then was put in charge of the first movie, which you may have heard of. It's called Toy Story. And so he and various and sundry other people did that. He went on and was involved in a lot of the other early Pixar movies and is now retired. There were a number of uses that came out from this original Daemon. This was a colorized version which got done, and this is the first time you start seeing him wearing shoes. The Daemon, he wasn't really a shoe kind of character, but people are like, oh, well, that's too informal. He doesn't have any clothes on, but he needs to have shoes. So anyway, I have an example of this shirt up here. This shirt comes with a limited warranty on the back of it. And I'm going to read the limited warranty because it's particularly amusing. This shirt is provided as is with no warranty either expressed or implied. Any damages incurred from wearing this shirt are the sole responsibility of the wearer. The wearer should be prepared to briefly explain hundreds of times what BSD and UNIX mean. Remember, that's not well known at that time. The wearer should also note that this shirt is not flame retardant, bulletproof, or associated with any toll-free 800 numbers. Modifications to the shirt are allowed as long as this notice and the UNIX trademarks remain intact. The shirt owner may freely allow others to wear this shirt within the express terms and limitations of this license. It was right around the time of the lawsuit. That's probably what triggered this particular warning, in fact. BSDI, when they first started up, did a few things that were sort of brilliant marketing, but weren't thought through on the legal side. So, for example, they had a phone number 1-800-ITS-UNIX. And for some reason, AT&T took comeuppance with this. Oh, and then they also promoted the fact that it was UNIX at 99% off what AT&T charges. St. Olaf's College was one of the early organizations that they used FreeBSD in their computer science department. And so they asked if they could put this on their computer science T-shirt, and I did agree to it. And of course, the deal with that is that then the royalties that I would collect when I would agree to let them use it were 2 copies of the shirt, ostensibly one for me and one for my partner Eric. Except that Eric pretty quickly is like, will you just stop giving me all these Daemon shirts? There's nowhere I can wear them. This again is still using the early Daemon, and it's the Bay Area Large Installed System Administrators T-shirt. So I got one of these to show you. Bay Lisa on the front, and then on the back is working on Ethernet cable. None of you probably even know what that is, but anyway, that was the way we used to do the internet. The last of the ones in this style was one that was done by the folks that were responsible for RDist, which was an early version of rsync. Trying to promote that letting somebody arbitrarily push software to your system is a perfectly fine and peaceful thing to be doing. You've now seen the first John Lasseter and a whole bunch of stuff about the first John Lasseter. The second John Lasseter was when we finally did the 4.3 BSD textbook. We had been wanting to do a textbook about BSD since about 1983. We went to Addison Wesley. They were all excited about it. And they said, of course, we need to get a release from AT&T to have you talk about it. And so we went to AT&T, and AT&T said, we're not really sure about that. I mean, they just shut down the John Lyons book, which was one that literally just annotated the source code of an early version of Unix. But that was like handing out the code. And, the code, in those days, this was pre-copyright for code. It was trade secret. And if other people can see it, then it's not a trade secret anymore. So, I mean, that was a legitimate thing to shut down. But they said, well, we're not really sure, whether you'd be divulging too many of our trade secrets. So we'll tell you what, go ahead and write the book, and then we'll read it and let you know if it's okay to publish it. Well, needless to say, nothing happened. So the Bach book came out in 1986. And the Bach book documented, like, literally, this function with these parameters, and you call it and it does this and so on and so forth, which was way lower in the system than we were going to talk about. We were going to talk about the high-level structure and algorithms and so on. And so we took this book to Addison Wesley and said, look, they've just allowed one of their people to publish this book. And we're not going to get into anywhere near this level of detail. So, what do you say? Will you publish it? And they said, okay. So it took us 2 years, but in 1988, we were finally ready to publish. And instead of being 4.2, by that time we had 4.3. And so the first book that we did, which George is about to show you, was the 4.3 BSD book. Should you care to, when you're done, come up and look at it, that is a signed first edition. There was also an answer book that we did because it was so popular that they said, well, how about an answer book so it can be used in courses? That was so popular that it even got translated into Japanese, as was the textbook. And in fact, Hiroki, who's in our audience here, was one of the people that helped oversee that translation, and it was one of the best translations that was ever done of any version of our book. So when this book came out, it was available, all over the place. The school board for the state of Nebraska had to approve it for the school library. And they looked at it and they said, oh no, this has got the devil on the front cover. We can't possibly allow this into our school. They didn't look inside the book, mind you. So I get this panicked letter from Addison Wesley saying, oh my God, we've got to write something explaining why it's okay for this book to be in their library. I'm telling George about this. And George I said, no, don't do that. Just put a big thing across the front of the book that says banned in Nebraska. Anyway, they didn't take him up on that idea. They got it into the school board. Probably one copy that got sold there. The story about this actually being done, we're still back at Lucasfilm. Actually, it might have been Pixar by then. John Lasseter is still there, and as is Sam Leffler. So Sam says, well, John, you did that original black and white one, but could you do a color one for our 4.3 textbook? And so when you come up and take a look at this, he literally pulled a piece of blue cardboard out of the trash can, grabbed some chalk off the chalkboard, this is pre-whiteboard days, and drew this whole thing up in the space of, I was told, about 20 minutes. You'll notice, both in the earlier one and this one, that he has a very Disney-like look to him. It looks like the kind of a character that you would see in a Disney movie. And the reason is because he had been a lead animator for Disney for 20 years and just had that in his head. Luckily, Disney has never come after us, so thank goodness for that, because they have a huge checkbook. I mean, they bribed Congress to give them 120 years of copyrights, and I think they may even push that a bit further. Anyway, the upshot was that we then got this, and can't see it, but when you come up, you'll see right under his tail there, it is signed by John Lasseter, J. Lasseter 88. And you'll see on the textbook that his name is not there because, of course, we'd never put the artist's name because who would know or care? I did credit him, so if you go to the copyright page, you'll see that he is credited with having done that bit of work, and that was as far as I was able to get. Putting this on the cover of our textbook, by the way, was another amusing story. They went to Addison Wesley and said, oh, we've got the artwork for the front cover of this book. And they took a look at it and they go, oh, no, you don't. This is a serious computer science textbook. We're not putting some cranky cartoon character on the front of it. But someone had told me that authors get a certain amount of control. And so I just said, no, there's not a lot I'm asking for, but this is going on the cover. And so they did in fact get it. You'll notice that the glowing orb was supposed to say BSD UNIX, but that got kiboshed. So it's just a glowing orb. We got it onto the book, and that book then proceeded to sell 50,000 copies, which was a record. Our contact at Addison Wesley said, yes, I walked in wearing one of the T-shirts at, one of the meetings. Normally they're all, in those days, in, suits and white shirts and ties and so on. And everyone just smiled at me because he had the best-selling textbook at that point. This is an early version of one of the stitched shirts. So a stitch pattern of the BSD guy. I actually commissioned somebody to do a larger stitching pattern. It turns out that there are 24,999 stitches because that's the limit of what the stitching machines can deal at that time. And so they actually, it was slightly over that, and I sent it to the company and they said, it crashes our computer. You need to get rid of some stitches. I had a 2-month tour of Australia. In Australia, they had a spring meeting and a fall meeting. And the fall meeting was always a central meeting, so for the whole country in some place. But then the spring meeting, each of the 7 states had their own meeting, and they set them up so they were a week apart. And so I would come in, I'd fly in, and be for a week in that city. I'd usually teach a 1 or 2 day tutorial, and I'd give a talk, and I'd have 2 or 3 days to run around and see things. It was one of those ones where, I was going to be traveling for 2 months. The thought of being in a hotel for 2 months was a bit over the top. And so I said, you guys are on a low budget. I hate hotels for that long. So if you can just find somebody, that will put me up at their house. Occasionally you end up in the middle of a dysfunctional family, but, it's like a week. You can put up with it. And usually it's pretty rare when that happens. But the other thing was, this is before the days where everybody's pictures was all over the internet. And so it was also at the days when you could just come to the gate. So I would land Darwin, Australia, or wherever I was going, and I'd walk off the plane, and now I had no idea, other than the name of the person, who it was that was supposed to pick me up. And I would just scan the set of people that were standing there, and you can pretty quickly say, all right, it's either that guy or that guy. Just from the way they're dressed and the way they look. They have that sort of geek look to them. So I would just walk up and say, hi, I'm Kirk McKusick. I'm looking for John Doyle or whoever it was it's supposed to be. And half the time they'd go, oh, that's me. How did you know? And it's like, clairvoyance. The other half of the time they'd go, no. And so oh, sorry, sir. I never had to go past 2. If I didn't get it on the first one, I always got it on the second one. Case of Darwin, I had just come from Melbourne, and I was staying with Robert Ells in Melbourne. He was still living in the house he grew up in. I said, well, how did that work out? Did your parents die? And he goes, no, kids grow up, parents move out. He was totally into cricket, and he was a member of the cricket club, and that's one of these things where there's like a 25-year waiting list to get into it. But his parents had put him on the list when they first got married, which was about 15 years before he was born. And so by a large single-digit age, he was in the club, and of course his parents were in the club, and so he was going. And so if there was a cricket match, he was there. That was, everything else came to a screeching halt. And this is like cricket the way it's supposed to be played. It goes over 7 days. You go in the morning, you have a lunch break, goes through the afternoon. It goes on for 4 to 5 days until it finally happens. They now have speed cricket where they do it in 1 day, if you can believe that. Of course, there was some cricket going on at that point, so he took us to the cricket dome, which is this amphitheater that holds 70,000 people. And it was pretty full, except that we were in the group that got to sit in chairs on the field, and little people would run out and give you beverages and food and all the rest of it. And the cricket players would come walking by, and these people all knew them, and they would be high-fiving them and saying, "Oh, good play," blah blah blah. It was pretty weird. Anyway, I fly to Darwin. The entire population of the Northern Territory in which Darwin exists is 140,000 people, of which something like 35,000 live in Darwin. The entire population of the Northern Territory, well, half the Northern Territory population would fit in the place that I had just been full of people in Melbourne. The airport is sort of what you might expect in an outback post like that. There's the landing strip, and then there's just one of those sort of metal half-dome things that looks like it's from a World War II thing, probably was. And it's blazing hot there because you're almost up towards the equator. And so I come walking off this plane, this is in the middle of summer, and it's like I'm walking across the black macadam, and it's so hot that my shoes are going as I sort of pick them up off the. So I like make a beeline to get into the terminal where it presumably will be air conditioned. Air conditioning is 2 overhead fans that are moving at about that rotational speed, and it is beastly hot in there. So I just come in outside the building where everyone else is and stand in the shade while they unload the luggage, which is just taking it off the plane and putting it on a cart, and then they pull the cart over next to the building, and it's up to you to get your bag off the cart. I get my bag, and we go to the parking lot, which is just a grass strip. There's no parking fee. This person's vehicle is, it's a 4x4, and it's got the exhaust pipe comes up and has a little manifold here, and the air intake comes up with a thing over here, and it's a diesel engine, so there's no ignition. So, I'm thinking, well, yeah, this is kind of nuts, but all right, whatever. And we get in, and we roll down the windows, and all right, so we've aired out the hot air. And I say, oh, well, shouldn't we roll up the windows and turn on the AC? And he goes, I don't think the AC has worked in this in years. In fact, I get to his house, and there's no AC in the house either. He said, oh, but we'd like to take a shower. You look kind of sweaty. I say, yeah. I said, would you like me to turn on the hot water? I'm like, maybe not. And because the cool sounds good. I turn on the cold water, and it's coming out of the ground at 94 degrees. So it's, not cool at all. And I'm trying to shave with my electric shaver, and it's like my face is just sweating. So I wipe it with a towel and go with the razor as fast as I can, but it just clogs because of all the sweat that's coming. They did have one of the overhead fans in my room, and I just lay on top of the bed. And when I get up in the morning and sit up, there's an outline of me in sweat on the bed. Anyway, he says, you get used to it, and it's true, you do get used to it. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, on the off days, I would say, well, could I borrow your car? And, I'll drop you at work, and then I'll go out and tourist around, and then come back and pick you up at the end of the day. He goes, oh, no, I'll take the day off. Oh, no, you don't need to do that. No, I'd like to. It's like, well, you offered twice, so you're stuck. It turns out it was a good thing he did this, because he took me out into the outback, and you go through these gullies, and the gullies have these little posts with measurements of depth. And I'm like, what's that for? And he goes, oh, well, if there's a flash flood, you need to know how deep it is. And, your vehicle, can't go through more than a certain depth of water because, it'll float, and then you won't be able to control where you're going. So, it's like, okay, fine. Anyway, so we get way out there. And then I hadn't quite realized, because it was my first day there, that they have downpours every afternoon at this time of year. And so, of course, we get this just, torrential downpours. And now we're starting to head back. And suddenly those things that had been dry are full of water. And we get to the first one, and it's like 2 feet. He's like, oh, yeah, that's fine, And we go in, and you hear the engine sort of burble, 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 and coming up. And he's like, I understand why he's got those things now. And then finally we get to one, it's just borderline. So he actually gets out and he walks across to see, how high it goes on him. And okay, that's going to be okay. And so we go through that. And we get to the next one, and it's not even that deep. And he says, well, I'm not sure about this one. I said, does it mean you have to walk across it? And he goes, no, we're going to wait till it gets down to an acceptable level. I say, what's the difference? A higher current or something? He goes, no, this one has crocodiles in it. And, like I said, I was glad he was in charge of driving. Well, enough of this story. Commentary about the Daemon. This was FreeBSD, sticking it to DOS. I normally don't let the Daemon be involved in anything that would be deemed to be violent, but I figured he's just popping a balloon, and he's popping a really useful balloon, so let's go for it. This was done by some folks that were fans of the Atlanta Braves baseball team, which had an Indian theme back in those days that they no longer have for good reason. This brings us up to the third version of the BSD Daemon. Again, drawn by John Lasseter, and you can see this was commissioned for the 4.4 BSD book, which George will also show you. You'll notice on the 4.4 book, his signature appears on the front cover because by this time he's a famous person. So, of course, we're going to have his signature on the front cover. Anyway, I had gone to John and said, I want you to do another version of the daemon. And, the previous ones were kind of static, so I want something with a little more action going on it. So he actually did some hand sketches, and so I picked the one that was kind of like this. Fine, he'd agreed to do it and draw it and so on. But he was in the middle of Toy Story. Toy Story was just coming to conclusion of production. And of course, he was just manically busy. I made friends with his secretary. I'd say, well, any idea when John might be able to do this? And she'd say, oh, well, I've talked to him. He's ready to do blah, blah, blah. I had some reason that I was going by there, so I just decided to drop in and see her. This was in the days when you could still walk into the facility. I said, oh, how's it going? Oh, well, he got his pen set out and asked me to get them cleaned up and inked. I think that's forward progress. And so I thanked her, and I also gave her a box of chocolates, which did seem to help move things along. I then, got a call from her. She said, okay, it's done. It's ready to pick up. So I went in and I, saw the picture, and she said, yeah, I put the paper down and the pens and the inks all down. And he just sort of sat there and froze and said, it's been 5 years since I've drawn a cell. I don't even know if I still have that skill set. And then dipped the black pen in and went. This was done in under 10 minutes. Colorizing everything. She got a whole bunch of flowers for that one. You'll notice here that, he'd just been standing pointing at the orb, and now he's trying to skewer the orb. And so the orb is taken off like a shot. The problem when we gave this to the Addison Wesley people is they say, that looks too much like a sperm cell. So when you look at the front of the book, you'll notice that the glowing orb is missing.
Also on the back, too.
Yeah, no, it's not to be found anywhere on that book. They put his signature there, but not the glowing orb. I went back to the same person that had done the stitching for the 4.3 and got this one. At this time, the machines had improved. They could get all the way up to 32,766 stitches, -2. I think they were just being cautious. There's 2 different versions of this that got made. There was this one, which was the standard one that anybody could get. And then there was one that had no text on it. And the only way that you could get one of those was if you had commit privileges to the machines at Berkeley. Or actually if you'd contributed and had some of your code committed. That was another reason you could get it. So, along comes the release of the Net 2 version of BSD. We had done Net 1, which was just the TCP/IP code and all the way through all the utilities, the important things like rlogin and RSH. Thank God finally got rid of. That was fine. No problem with that. But then we started getting a lot of requests for, well, can't you give us more? Keith Bostick basically set about, trying to get the utilities and libraries done. We'd go to UNIX conferences and he'd get up and say, get your name in lights, rewrite some of the utilities or parts of the libraries. And, we thought, yeah, that'll work. And this stuff would come in and, it was some of the easy things, cat. And, then someone tackled LS, and just the number of options in LS makes it a bigger program. And these things would come in, and I would say many of them were rather amateurish in the terms of the way they were written. So Keith would pretty much rewrite it from top to bottom, but he wouldn't put his name on it. It was always the name of the contributor. And I said something like, Keith, you basically wrote this. Why, at least put your name on there. He goes, there's no end to the good you can do in this world by giving credit to other people. And furthermore, that's who they're going to go after. ATT is concerned about it. So the upshot was that Mike Carls and I were in charge of dealing with the kernel, but we couldn't really say, rewrite, the kernel. So we weren't quite sure how to deal with that. But we figured that Keith wasn't going to get anywhere. So he comes walking into our office at some point and says, well, guys, I've got over half of the libraries and utilities done. How's that kernel coming? And I look at Mike, and Mike looks at me and goes, holy shit, we're going to have to do something. We're like, well, how do we deal with this? And Keith Bostic, in his usual way, came up with a great answer. He said, well, we started from 32V. So we took the original source code to 32V, and then we ran it through the CB, the C beautifier to put it in a standard format, and then built a database of every line. And then we did the same thing with our kernel, and then did a line-by-line match. And so, are there any, what in our kernel matches something that was in 32V? And, a brace on a line by itself, those kinds of things you ignore. But if you get 2 or 3 or certainly 4 lines that were identical, you go, aha, we need to do something about that. So I remember like one of the early ones was when, you're doing something where you need to look up a process. So the system call gives you a PID, and it was just a linear search through, the originally 16 possibilities. But it was getting to be a linear search through a rather longer list. And we're like, well, we should do a hash lookup for that. And that, of course, is a different implementation. So not only did it get rid of the AT&T code, it also made it work better. Anyway, so we did a lot of that, and we had it down to the point where there were really only about 6 files left that there was any significant matching. And we were ready to just tackle those. And Mike says, if we release a complete system, that's going to just raise a lot more red flags than if we just say, well, it's an incomplete kernel. We've just released the parts that we could release. And not really mention the fact that there's only 6 files that aren't in there. Well, we put the 6 files in, but just the templates for what the calls ought to be. So that then became networking release 2. And so far that started out fine. And in fact, we had lots and lots of people that paid $1,000 to get it. I mean, we figured we'd sell 3 copies. It would go up on the net for free download, and that would be that. But people felt that the $1,000 for the piece of paper from the university that says you're free to redistribute this was worth the money. And they'd often say, don't bother sending the tape. At any rate, we sold about 1,000 of those. So about $1 million came in from that, which was good because this company called BSDI started up, and I'd already talked about, ended up being sued by AT&T. They get into the first court, and they said, well, we only wrote these 6 files. All the rest of these, there's this piece of paper from the University of California that says it's, freely redistributable. So which of these 6 files is problematic for you? Well, of course, those had been, done in a clean room and were completely fine. And so, the judge says, well, I guess I'm going to throw this case out. So then they co-sued the University of California. And of course, as soon as the University of California got it, they stopped distributing it like that mattered. I mean, we'd already sent out, gazillion copies. So that wasn't any sort of a big setback. But then the university's like, well, why exactly should we actually be defending this? I mean, we're not, not making any money on it. And, So anyway, we had some money. We said, well, we can cover some of the cost. But, it was things like, well, we need an expert to go up against their, world-class expert. Well, we don't have the money for that, so I got to be the expert. And that's another whole story, but I'm not going to tell that one right now. At any rate, as part of this, I decided, well, we needed to have some T-shirts, to fight back on this. And the chances of getting John Lasseter to do this again was just like 0. So I went to a friend of ours who's a portrait artist. And so this was nothing like anything she'd ever done before. And I said, well, I want to get a couple pictures that I can use on T-shirts. So this was one where she has the demon slam dunking the Death Star through the hoop. The logo that we put underneath this on the shirt was Net2 USL0. And unfortunately, I have no copies of that shirt. Back in Star Wars 1, there was this big thing called the Death Star. This was a brand new logo for AT&T, and we said that logo looks like the Death Star. And so it became known as the Death Star logo. On this particular one, we have the demon standing on top of the world in my Birkenstocks, I might add, skewering the Death Star. This one we did on shirts that said, Free the Berkeley 4.4. The next one in the pile is the same one, but without the text, which again is the same story of the special one that, you had to be an inside person in order to get it. So anyway, these shirts sold extremely well. In fact, I still have a check from Dennis Ritchie for one of them, which I chose not to cash. But Dennis said, look, Kirk, I understand where you're coming from. I support what you're doing, but that logo that you're using is the AT&T logo, and it's not AT&T that's suing you. It is USL. And I would really appreciate it if you would use the USL logo on your t-shirts. So I did a new run of the t-shirts with the USL logo. And I have, of course, the original artwork for this. C. Peel, you can see signed there. She didn't normally sign her artwork, or if she did, only on the back, but I prevailed on her. I said, you know, this is commercial art. You need to sign the front. And if you look through there's not another single one of her pictures. Actually, there's one other that she did for me that she signed, but that's it. FreeBSD first came out, and so, you know, they wanted to get a t-shirt. There's, of course, the very well-known one from Walnut Creek, where it's sort of the demon walking with the CD rolling out ahead of them. But this was the very first one before they had gotten that logo. So this is just the same one that you've seen, but it adds the FreeBSD at the top, and the daemon is free because it's, you know, the free distribution. Of course, John Lasseter always appears on anything I do. Other of the groups also used the daemon early on. So this was an early NetBSD, and even OpenBSD was using the daemon early on. And I had one more. The FreeBSD Foundation had the daemon in a suit. Of course, all of the distributions and the foundation have now all gone away from using the daemon, mostly because the PR in some parts of the world is not so great because it's viewed as an evil spirit, so have moved on to their own logos. Just for amusement and grins and giggles, this is actually the copyright assignment. The more interesting part, of course, is the second page, where it's signed by me and also then co-signed by him. This was assigning it to me as a work for hire, which I then, of course, filed with the Copyright Office. And it turns out, someone pointed out to me, you know, that was 1988. You got to renew it every 35 years. So I'm actually in the process of getting it renewed. I have time for questions. There's my email, my website, my YouTube channel.